am really, really thrilled to be joined by someone I've known for many, many years, both professionally and personally, Glen Burgess. And without me going into a long diatribe of what Glen has been through and his experiences, Glen, it's probably best to hear it from you. So can you give everybody an idea of who you are, what your background is, and what you're up to these days?
Sure, you bet, Daryl. Thanks. Yeah, I'm Glen Burgess, and I'm currently the Deputy Fire Center Manager in the Kamloops Fire Center, part of the British Columbia Wildfire Service. I guess my background goes back to 1986, where I graduated from tech school in forestry background and started on an initial attack crew literally 3 days later. And I've been involved in wildfire response and/or forestry operations since then. So a little over 35 years, I guess, now going into that, maybe more. A good portion of that has been with the Wildfire Service and doing wildfire response. And so I did move my way up through the organization as an operations chief and then as an incident commander, and spent 5 years leading one of our provincial incident management teams through 2014 through the 2018 seasons, which I'm sure most of you are well aware of what 2017 and 2018 looked like in British Columbia. And so, I think deployed for over 300 days in those years in total, which when you think about how short our season in BC is, that gives you an indication of how often I was out on the fire line with my team. So doing a lot of that, and I've moved into the management realm now, where I still participate actively as a coach and as a leader to help the up and comers in the incident management team realm, but in general, leading and managing the Kamloops Fire Center from the operational perspective.
And we'll get into, that the young Glen, and then contrast that with not the old Glen, but the older, more experienced Glen that we see now. One of the biggest things I think that we miss as leaders, and when we talk about development, is the self-mastery required around leadership. And by that, I mean, how do we manage our emotions, our stress levels, all of those things? Because in my experience, if we can't control the inside, then our ability to control or positively influence the outside is lost, right? Our communication goes down the tubes, all of those other things. So can you maybe talk about when you arrive on scene or you're deployed and you're looking after an incident management team, you don't even know which way is up in a lot of cases. What are you feeling and what are you thinking as you arrive on scene or you start to interact with different people? So Glen, the incident commander, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Are you feeling stressed out, overwhelmed? Can you walk us through what that might look like?
Yeah, I think there comes a bit of stress and anxiety, but for me personally, I kind of thrive on those things. So really, there's an excitement that comes with taking on a new project or a new incident. And so there's that, but you need to temper that excitement and enthusiasm with the reality of the impact on others that it's having. And particularly when you're in the public realm, is one thing to be on a wildfire out in the hinterland where there's nobody around and you're, just going about your business. But today, the reality today is we technically only go to the large scale interface fires, which means people are being negatively impacted either through our actions or through, in their minds, our lack of action. It's almost never Mother Nature's fault. It's always our fault in some respect. So I think, working with my folks, my team always is about, we're excited to be here. We love doing what we're doing, but we need to temper that with the reality of the impacts on others and that sort of social awareness of our actions and behaviors, and particularly as the incident commander, because you are at that point, you are the representative of government. Doesn't matter what color shirt you have on, what crest you have on, you are the representative of government. And I think always remembering that and remembering that your behaviors are reflected upon that. But I think for me, stress reactions are different in everybody. And I think it's something that, I had to learn what stress reactions looked like in myself to manage that. And sometimes that's a little tricky to do. And quite honestly, when you're 23 years old, you don't have a good sense for that. So that's really for me is recognizing, and you spoke to that, is, you know, how do you get to that point where you do recognize your own, I don't want to say weaknesses, and I hate the term opportunities for growth, but the reality is you need to recognize the impact you have on others, not just the influence, but the actual impact.
And so let's talk about that, because you know, we've heard words like empathy, vulnerability, and compassion, and you know, 10 years ago, these are not words that were even in the vernacular when it came to talk about leadership, because the model was always about hard charging, fearless, and, you know, just get stuff down, all of those other things. So can you speak to some of the you know, those new words that we're starting to see with regard to building connection? And you talked about the social aspect of leadership. So things like empathy, vulnerability, and compassion, because I know, just knowing you personally, you're very, very aware and very, very good at those social interactions and the importance of what that looks like. So can you maybe shed some light on your approach to dealing with people using empathy and all of those things?
Yeah, and I think there's two sides of that, right? There's this side that you need to work with on the internal side of your own incident management team and working with those. But then there's the public facing side as well. And the reality is, in the internal facing side, your own organization, your own people, you get to know them, you develop those relationships, but you have to understand them to understand their perspective. And so something I talk about when people ask me what my job is as an incident commander, you know, I said, well, you know, really, if you break it down, I'm 90% team psychiatrist. That's what I do. I talk to the rest of my team. I make sure that they're okay, and that they're okay to do their jobs, and that I provided them the support, the resources, and all those things. At the end of the day, they're making the decisions. Sure, my name goes on the dotted line, but, you know, so I need to make sure that they're okay, and particularly of a mental state to perform their job adequately. On the flip side, when you're dealing with the public facing side, again, as the face of the organization, whether it's the incident or the complex or whatever it is, the public is looking for a leader at times who is good at making decisions and clearly makes decisions and talks about the decisions they made and why they made them, but understanding the impact that those decisions are having on those that are affected by that. And, you know, you need to empathize with those people, but I think they still expect you to make the hard decisions. And I like to talk a lot about making decisions and accepting the consequences of that, and knowing that not every decision is going to be popular. But if you waffle and do nothing, the public facing side doesn't like that either. And so you do need to balance the empathy with what I like to call that sort of command and control. You're coming in, you're making a decision, you're clearly the person who's in charge. So I think, you know, really there's both sides of that. And that was something it took me, to be honest, quite a few years to kind of figure out a little bit. I was always a bit of a bull in a china shop. So,
and I think it speaks to the challenge that leaders have with regard to balancing needing to get the job done while still making sure that you don't scorch everybody else in your wake, you know, and that constant giving and taking. And so how do you manage that? Because that really speaks to that dance that a leader has to have. Because if you're too empathetic or you're too compassionate, you're not going to do the job. But if you're too decisive, then you're going to burn out your people. So in your experience, how do you manage that if you do?
Yeah, and you know, where we've made a shift, my team made a shift a number of years ago, particularly with the public facing side of our decision making, was, you know, historically government has a process where we'll make a decision, we put it on a plan, and we send it out for comment. We're clear that the decision's been made, but now we want your comment. So where we tried to move towards, particularly after some tough learnables in 2017, was let's engage those that are going to be impacted before we actually make the decision, and talk about the decision talk about the impacts, the consequences. And while we make it clear we are still the decision makers, I think if you engage the appropriate clients, stakeholders, partners, First Nations, community groups, whatever it is that are potentially going to be impacted by your decision, they still might not like the decision, but they were a part of the discussion around it. And I think it just sets a completely different tone. And I do the same with my own team. The word collaboration gets thrown around a lot. The word, though, and the practice, it's easy to say the word, it's hard to practice that, particularly in a top-down hierarchical organization that's about command and control. So really working, and frankly, I've had success when we've made a decision. The outcome was what we would suggest might have been an unintended outcome. It didn't turn out how we wanted, but because everybody had been engaged, the outcry or the bounce back was a lot less than had we just done it and then said, oh, by the way, sorry, this went horribly wrong.
And you bring up a really important point, because during crisis, right now we're recording this while COVID happens, but I think this is a characteristic of crisis in general, where to be agile and respond, you need to really flatten the organization and have the ability to reach out to the subject matter experts that normally you wouldn't even talk to. And so is that now just part of your approach in general? If there's a decision to make, for the most part, one of the first things you do is do I have the right people at the table here? And if I don't, let's go reach out and bring them in to this table. Is that really what you're saying?
Yeah, you bet. We call it, we actually coined a phrase, I can't remember what it was, but really, it's about bringing the people in. But again, I think it needs to be clear. There typically failings of organizations are when you don't have clear decision making. You can't make every decision by committee. In fact, you can't make any decision by committee, in my opinion. But and so particularly in a command and control situation, it still needs to be clear who the decision maker is. But it's who do you engage? You engage the right people. And so you talked about subject matter experts, which of course we always want to bring in. But what's the definition of a subject matter expert nowadays? I'll argue that a traditional elder from a First Nations community could be a subject matter expert, not necessarily on firefighting, but on the impacts to that land base, and more importantly, the impacts to their community in the event of. And so expanding your definition of what a subject matter expert is to include, for example, local politician. If you get the local mayor on side, or the local whoever, MLA, whoever it is, who may not even necessarily have a legal obligation or jurisdiction, they're going to tell 2 friends who are going to tell 10 others, who are going to tell 400 others. Like, you just need to think about the impacts of that and how do you get all the right people. Obviously, our organizations like ours are huge for having community meetings. Let's have a community meeting and bring everyone in and tell them what we're doing. Those can go horribly well, horribly wrong, or very, very well. But the test for me was, as we connect with the right people, communicate our message up front. I went through the 2018 wildfire season and worked a number of large fires in small communities and didn't have one request for a public meeting, because we had engaged all the right people up front who then communicated our message. We made sure we had great, adequate messaging. So we brought the right subject matter experts in. Their expertise wasn't technical knowledge, it was social. And that is where you can really rely on a lot of that sort of, we'll call it collaborative decision making, but really what is it's collaborative conversation about the decision we're about to make.
So what do you tell the leaders that are reluctant to do that? Because in my experience, a lot of times a leader is reluctant to bring in outside assistance because maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's an insecurity or something like that. But what do you tell tell that person that's used to making decisions in a vacuum and really dictating or mandating what that decision is? Because what I'm hearing you say is to make the best decision, you have to bring in the knowledgeable people and bring them in earlier rather than later. But we don't always see that.
Yeah, and I think where you really need to go is and I always like to look at it this way: what's the consequence of my decision? So the more significant the consequence, the more people it impacts. That to me tells me the pendulum needs to go towards bring them in first early and bring in lots. Now, I'm not saying that you overload your incident level planning meeting with all these outsiders, because we have a business to run as well. But there's nothing saying you can't have a separate process to engage those right people. And there's a reluctance to do that. You're right. Some people like to make decisions, and I have the legal authority, I have the jurisdiction, I'm just going to make the decision. Okay. The consequence, though, of using that power and authority you have, you may not feel at your level, but somebody above you probably will. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes some time sometimes for up and coming leaders and who have authority to make decisions to understand the impacts and consequences of their actions. And once you learn that, you start to be a little more collaborative, if you want to use that buzzword, for sure.
So that's probably a good jumping off point, because to talk about the young Glen contrast with the one we see now, because in terms of my own leadership journey, I found that my leadership approach very much mirrored my maturity. And really when I first became a leader when I was young, it was all about me, and I was in charge, and people are going to do things that I'm telling them to do, to a certain extent. And as I've gone through, I've realized that that's the exact opposite approach. So what did the young Glen think about leadership? Well, I would submit you probably didn't even think about it as leadership, but looking back, who was the young Glen, and what would you tell young Glen now with all of your years of experience?
Yeah, I think thinking back, I was a very authoritative, dictatorial leader. There's no doubt about that. I think I was aware of the authority and the power I had based on the position I was in, and I used it. And I actually didn't think about the consequences. I just did. I knew I was allowed to. I knew it was potentially the right thing to do, or in my mind, I always believed it was the right thing to do, or I wouldn't do it. And so being oblivious or didn't care about the impacts of those decisions. And it's something I talk to leaders about now is, and not even in crisis management, but in day-to-day leadership, there's what I call leadership by position. And then there's being a leader. And leadership by position really means you just are a supervisor and you have line authority over the people who work for you. So of course they have to do what you tell them. Because you're a supervisor doesn't make you a good leader, just means the job says you're a leader. You need to round that out. And I think it took me some time to learn that. Yeah, I'm a supervisor. I can tell you what to do. It doesn't, and so early in the career, I think we're always happy to get promoted at first to become that, what we all call a leader. I would now call a supervisor, because I think there's a difference. And so, that's something that I would, and I work with people, and in hindsight, I would obviously do differently. If I was 35 years younger and had today's knowledge, clearly I would approach it differently. But that's part of the learning. And I think sometimes you just need someone, hopefully, to sit you down and set you straight. And over the years, there's been a couple of people who had those difficult conversations with me. And at the time, it really, really annoyed me. But, when you look back, you go, you know what, maybe they were right.
Just a little bit right, not totally right.
I think about an instructor in a leadership course once who we were having a couple of beverages after the course, and I asked for some feedback because I didn't feel I was getting the feedback I needed in the course. And she was pretty blunt with me, and she just said, I'll give you one thing. She said, you got to think before you talk. So kind of a light bulb moment, right? So,
right.
Not that I still today, sometimes I still do it, but I'm more careful if I talk before I think.
But isn't it could be as simple of a shift, like that. And it brings up a really good point from a leadership perspective. During meetings, are you the first one to talk, and are you the only one to talk? Because if you are, that's supervising, and that's probably now creating compliance and not commitment. Whereas if you're a leader, you're creating commitment with that. And can you speak to the as a leader, what your job is around the people part of the job? And you talked about it when you first started, but you said that that's a big part of the job. But what does that look like on the ground when you talk about being the team psychiatrist kind of thing? What does that actually look like when you're deployed? Because let's face it, you shouldn't have time, air quotes, to be talking to people about their feelings and stuff. Don't you have a job to do, Glenn?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you know what? That's what people ask me. They said, what do you do? And I like to tell them that I don't actually do anything. I have staff to do all the work. That's the point. I have an ops chief. I have a plans chief. I have a finance chief. I have a communications, so I think if you actually think about that and you delegate all the work that needs to be done, what is your job at that point? Facilitate the resources and what they need and the support they need to make good decisions to bring to you for that final head nod. And so I think something that I really work on, and in a simple example around an ICP where I have all my section chiefs in and around and they're all busy, just walking around with a cup of coffee, talking to them, you get a sense of what's going on and how your incident's running. The other thing I use was on a large fire camp, I'll go into the mess tent when the crews and all the operations staff and everybody's eating. Based on the tone of the conversation, you know how your incident's going. I don't mean how's the fire going. I mean, how's the organization functioning? If people are quiet and head down and they feel like crap and, versus they're telling jokes and talking about tomorrow, and you instantly I use that as the biggest temperature gauge on how I'm doing as an incident commander and how my team is doing. If the mood is jovial, I've seen crews who've had their butts kicked for a week straight on the fire line, still feeling great about how things were going because the camp's going okay. They're getting the support they need. They don't feel like they're being overwhelmed, at least not resource-wise. So I think that the term situational awareness, right? Like just being aware, and I spend a lot of time just talking to my people, direct reports. The other thing I like to do is, I spend time with the crews, the ground level people, chatting with them. It's sometimes is an awkward conversation as the incident commander. You go and you sit down at their table while the crew's eating, and they're like, uh-oh.
But the conversation stops.
But I got to tell you, if you can get them to talk, you'll know how things are going. And you'll know if your ops chief is doing a good job or not, talking to a crew. Same with the unit leaders and everybody else. So spend the time. We as a team used to have an informal meeting every morning around the coffee pot. We had a logistics chief who always made his own coffee. It was terrible, but he had a coffee pot in the logistics trailer, and we would go in there. And some mornings we wouldn't even talk. We would just all sit there as a team and have a cup of coffee before anything else got going. You can gauge that and interact and be part of it. They all knew that I was in charge per se. But I think leadership is recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of yourself and helping others recognize their own. And then to me, encouraging them to provide feedback back up. We do a lot of evaluations downwards, but you need to listen to what they're getting from the bottom up as well. So,
well, and I think most organizations have 360 feedback and some sort of mechanism. Well, during crisis, sometimes that gets thrown out the window, for example. So that's an important point, is to always be receiving that feedback. But let's say that I'm a leader and somebody tells me that, you know what, boss, and they'll maybe say it more politely, but you don't let us make any decisions, or you talk before I'm allowed to talk, or something like that. Like what would you tell that leader in terms of what to do with that feedback? Because there can be a tendency for us to be like, dude, you're just on the front line. You don't understand what I'm going through here. So how do you handle that? And again, I ask you because I know that you're very good at receiving feedback and asking for it.
Yeah, I think, it's one thing if you ask for feedback with the right intention. Sometimes people ask for feedback because they know it's the right thing to do. They have no intention of following it or listening to it because they don't believe it, because they think they're already where they need to be. So I think it's about, suggesting that folks to that feedback will help them grow. And I use some of my own personal examples of feedback I've gotten and how it's helped me and moved me down the path of where I ended up. And some people still either like me or don't like me. I tend to recognize I can be a polarizing personality, but the recognition that if you're actually going to ask for feedback, you have to pay attention to it. And then then you need to prove to them that you heard it. And you can use all the buzzwords about active listening and all that, blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. But demonstrate that you heard what they told you by changing your behavior. And so what I talk about in leadership, it doesn't actually matter what you say. It's how you handle yourself. And, I'm good with a few quotes from different people, and I'm going to steal a quote, and I use this with my own staff. 3 simple words. Example is leadership. And if you haven't figured that out, you're not a good leader. Because it doesn't matter what you say. I can tell you all the great things you need to do, but as soon as I walk out of that room and I don't model the behavior that I expect of you, makes me not much of a leader in your eyes. And that's the biggest failing I see in crisis management. People talk the talk, but then they turn around and they do the exact opposite, or they don't do anything like that. And so the big one I push on people is you need to demonstrate and model the behavior and actions that you expect of others. And again, another buzzword, and I hate this one, actions speak louder than words, and you can throw them all out there, but it's true in leadership. Like, that's the key.
So that brings up a really, really interesting point with regard to, essentially you're talking about walking the walk and having your actions congruent with your words and so on. One of the things I think that as leaders we sometimes struggle with is the notion of self-care, taking care of yourself. And a lot of times we're telling other people, hey, get good sleep, eat properly, all of these other things, adhere to your shift, don't work later than you have to. And yet as leaders, we don't give ourselves the same permission. So what are your thoughts around what that looks like in terms of the leadership and the leaders needing to take care of themselves, especially in a marathon kind of, whether it be a campaign fire or a pandemic or something like that? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, and I think that's the first place you can demonstrate leadership, by leading by example. Like, you need to think about limiting your shifts, make sure you're eating right, do all the things that if you're suggesting others need to do that, then you need to do it as well. And I think if you're not healthy enough to be there to lead them, then you're failing as well. So I think that is a challenge. I think there's a perception that leaders, that I got to be the first one up, I got to be the last one to bed, I got to be the last one to eat, okay, until you can't function anymore. And so the recognition that you need to manage and moderate your own expectations of yourself to align with your expectations of others. And that's something that I really did struggle with. Like, people always ask me, how many hours a day did you work, and how many, and yeah, I probably, like most, worked too many hours on a large scale incident, but it was something I learned over time. And, I'm blessed actually that I sleep like a baby in a tent, in my own little single 4-person tent. And at the incident level, in the crappiest conditions, I still sleep well. And so, I like to refer to that as my superpower, being able to pretty much sleep. And so I think looking after the self from that perspective is the most important piece, because I've seen myself get run down to the point where I couldn't function. And now I'm failing the team, because then when they break down, I don't recognize it. And so now, the decision-making model starts to break. And now bad decisions get made and people get put at risk potentially. And so that sort of self-analysis and ability to self-reflect on your own mental state as much as physical state is important. And just a funny story actually about that was a realization for myself. We had a large-scale ongoing incident with quite a bit of impact to the public in a small community. And we brought our agency or ministry as a critical incident stress management program, or its peers who come and typically they get called in when there's a single incident that's occurred. In this case, we brought them in because there wasn't. It was an ongoing day after day after day. And I just thought, let's bring them into camp. And so a 3-person team came in and we tried to make sure they were available and talk to people that, and this is before we started to get down the road of, it's okay to not be okay, right? Like, we're all chest pounders and tough. We can do it all, and we never need to sleep, eat, or cry. And it was funny. They'd been there for a few days, and they were asking me how I was doing. I'm like, oh, I'm good. I don't need your help, and blah blah. And anyway, but when I looked back, every single day for 5 days in a row, I went and talked to one of them for over an hour. Subconsciously, I was reaching out to them. I didn't need it. I didn't feel I needed it, but yet I spent an hour a day talking to them about what was going on for me in the situation. So I actually talk about that story openly now when I'm in leadership and when I'm coaching. And I also talk openly about ending up in counseling after a fire season, because I think when people see other leaders in senior roles accept their own mortality, it creates an environment for them to go, oh, maybe it is okay to talk about this stuff or to engage others. And so I've actually had people reach out to me after speaking on things like that and say, you know what, that was great that you said that, because there's a stigma attached to this as a first responder to not being okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we see in crisis, people are so emotionally and personally invested in the incident, and they take so much ownership over it, which is good from, a commitment perspective, but we often forget that comes at a cost as well. When you're emotionally engaged into a situation, it's not just your job, and that has a real impact. And so I just also want to just add on to that with regard to one of the hardest things for me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. One of the few times I'll ever give a direct order is if somebody isn't taking a break or going home or taking care of themselves, because in my experience, they never want to go. And so the only time I'm a heavy typically is if they're not going home or they're not taking care of each other or themselves. Do you have a similar experience with your instance as well?
Yeah, for me, meal breaks and rest breaks and hours of rest between shifts are super important, and it's something I am a bit of a dictator on. And again, because I hold myself to the same standard. And so in a way to actually enforce it, we used to schedule a team meeting at 1:00. And the reason is because lunch was from 12:30 to 1 in most camps, in our camps, the hot lunch. So we would all gather for lunch, and I would make them gather for lunch because we're going to have a meeting at 1. So you got to be here anyway. And so that was my subliminal way of forcing them to take that break. And because otherwise they'll go grab food and go sit back at their desk and keep working.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it forced that, and that was part of it. And whether they recognize that's why I was doing that or not doing it doesn't actually matter. But that was things I've used. I've literally just walked up to people and said, go take a break, go for a walk, do something. I mean, that's the thing. I do it for myself. I do it for others. And I think that managing that mental and physical fatigue in a long drawn out incident, you think about some of the seasons we had in BC, like we went back to some of the same incidents 3 and 4 different times. Yeah. Like, how depressing is that? Oh, I'm going to set my tent up on the same square it was on 5 days ago. And
literally
back in the day, an IMT would go to a fire and we'd have it wrapped up 10, 12 days. We'd all give each other a high five and we'd go home. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're going out on 4 and 5 deployments back to the same fire. Now, admittedly, they were 100 kilometers farther along than they were last time, but different piece of ground, but your camp's in the same spot. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's been a huge emotional toll that comes with that. And in 2017 and 2018, where we started to get repetitive deployments to the same places, that's when we really had to manage that, because you don't have that same level of excitement that you do taking on a new incident. You're going back and you're like, oh, we're here again.
Right. It's not Groundhog Day, it's Groundhog Incident.
Yeah.
And especially when, well, because the name of the incident doesn't change, all of the geography is the same. There's not a lot of novelty in that.
Yeah.
And so now, what is the leader's job? So let's say that it's a marathon, right? Whether it be COVID or any other crisis, where maybe it's a longer haul. What is the leader's job, or what is their responsibility with regard to managing the tone and the pace and all of those other things? Because admittedly, sometimes it's friggin' hard to keep the sense of urgency up. And if people aren't, if they're not being deliberate and conscious, then complacency will step in, and risks and decisions won't get made properly. So how have you, in your experience, managed to deal with that tone and that pace and that tempo of a longer duration operation? Because I think the first few hours, first few days, you're right, there's an adrenaline kick that happens. There's all this stuff to do. So you go, but that's not where problems happen. It's now in the kind of maintenance phase. So how do you manage that from your perspective, from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, I think really is focusing on, as much as this is going to seem a bit weird, like these large scale incidents, the objectives never change. We know what the objective is, the big scale objective, but sometimes that can seem a bit insurmountable. And so I think we used to look to try and establish intermediate, shorter term goals, achievable things you knew you were going to be able to look at and achieve, because people crave being successful. When you go out for weeks and weeks on end, and every 5 days that incident expands exponentially, and you lose all the work you've done, or the work you've done now has no value because the wind shifted. So you need to sort of look to some of those pieces. And I think the other thing that we used to do, and we used to laugh about it within our team, we had what we called the social committee. They used to plan things to take our mind off of work, and we would do things. And, particularly when your command, your ICP or your camp is close to a small community, like we used to make an effort to get out into that community a bit and explore the local areas. And, one of the things my team used to do, we used to go to like the local farmers market. Like just things to break it up, because if you're focusing for 14 straight days or more on the same objective and the same thing, we get it. There's a job to be done, but you got to find a way. And so, one of the things is leadership for us for me was to say, let's do something different today. Let's change things up. In a perfect world, it had all of my IMT members been completely interchangeable and certified at the same level at all the different positions, we could have just swapped people around. Logistics, you're going to go do operations can do plant, whatever. Obviously, that's not realistic given capacity that we have in our program. And like most, we're all experts at something. And but to manage that sort of, I think having achievable objectives so you can celebrate some success. Because what we do is we focus on the negative. And an example I'll use, and it's something I learned in Australia this winter working there, is most agencies in Canada, if we have a negative outcome, and I'll use a wildfire, so we destroy 25 homes, a neighborhood gets burnt, what is in the news? 25 homes were destroyed today by the fire. Why don't we talk about the 2,000 that didn't burn and that we saved? And that the structure protection crews went out and saved. We don't celebrate success. As emergency responders, we tend to focus on where we didn't succeed. And in a large scale, long-term incident, those not success in things add up fast. That's why we have a long-term, large scale. So really trying to talk every day a bit about what went well. And it's all, we can talk about after action, what went well, what were the tricky, I'm not talking after action review. I'm talking about, let's talk about some success. And some days on the incident, success was nobody got hurt today. That was a success, because some days that literally was the only, everyone got fed, no one got hurt, and everybody's smiling, eating dinner. Perfect. Success.
And that speaks to the balance of leadership, where you want to be optimistic while still being realistic,
Yeah.
but not catastrophic in your thinking. Because one of the issues I've seen with COVID, and obviously this I think will be the sign of times to come, is the role social media has on the human psyche now, where, to exactly your point, there are millions of people in this particular context self-isolating voluntarily because it's the right thing to do. Yes, there will be a few people that aren't, but of course, that's what's hitting the media. That's what's hitting social media. And so it's really difficult. So I really like that, because as a leader, you have to focus on the positive, because I think, like you, I do this because I see the best in people. I see neighbors helping neighbors. I've seen my share of fatalities and all of that other stuff. But what keeps me coming back is that humanity is inherently good. And I think you would see that at your level as you're working with different communities and whatnot. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you bet. And I think that's where we need to, and I think back to the use of social media, and I think about 2017, where we got beat up constantly in social media and on the news and on everything else. And at the end of the day, I traced it back in my mind anyway, in my small vision of the world, which was limited to a few incidents, which were very large, but we created an information vacuum. We hid behind the standard PR info that we put out, and we didn't tell our story well enough. And so you create a void, and it gets filled in by the public. And 25 years ago, it got filled in by the local crackpot, and nobody listened to them anyway, so no one cared. But that local crackpot today has 2,000 followers on Twitter. And so when they say something, there's 2,000 other people who are like, he's right. And now off it goes. And so.
Yeah. And their Twitter following doubles because of this incident as well.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so where we've tried to work more proactively was, let's tell more of the story early on and up front. And whether it's through the knowledge experts or local community contacts, or however you want to do that, through social media, push more facts out. And then if they don't want to believe the facts, that's okay. But at least we gave them facts. And that works on all aspects in any kind of an incident. Like, if you have information, why not tell it if it's the truth? Now, understanding that there's sensitivity around certain things that can't be talked about. And as a response organization, all response organizations understand that. But the reality is, don't create an information void that will be filled in by the vocal minority. You need the majority to be on your side. And we saw that in 2018, a big pendulum swing. We pushed information out. And so when that vocal minority started to spin their version, people would get back on there and say, no, I just heard on the news, or I saw this on the web. What you're saying is not true. Now, if they choose not to believe your facts, that's okay. But at the end of the day, we need to be a lot more open and sharing with information, and that helps with that public perception, the social media, because the social media has a massive impact on your people. Particularly, you think about the average age now of first responders. They are experts at social media, and they literally spend every waking minute there. They're not on the fire line reading it. And when they get continually beat up and slandered and talked about what a crap job they're doing, it has an impact on them. And you can tell them all you want, stop reading social media. No, they're never going to stop. So I think understanding and using the tools that we have as leaders and as part of broader government or whatever organization you're with, to tell your story. As I used to say, I want to control the narrative of the information that's going out to the public.
Mm-hmm. And that's not to be confused with manipulate the facts.
Nope.
Controlling the narrative is telling the story as it should be told, not based on an interpretation from somebody or people that have zero awareness of what's truly going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that takes time and energy to do that. And it takes resourcing to do that. But the payoff is in the end. When you have the media outlets at the end of a long, busy season write an article about how great their experience was interacting with you and your team, and because of the open access you gave them to the facts and to the fire and to shoot that photo they really wanted to get or that video, like that's the payoff. Because now they're telling the public, you can trust what these guys are telling you. I was there. I actually saw it.
Right. And it's a lot of times it's in those informal interactions that they're having. And I think that organizations often forget that their best public relations people aren't the ones with the communications degrees. It's the individuals within your organization when they're talking to different people and recognizing that if they're sitting there and saying it's a poop show and I work for the organization, that's where the message also needs to live in terms of, hey, we're actually doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. And when the media and social media and the news outlets, whatever, are telling a positive story of what's going on, the impact on morale of your responders and of your agency it's instantaneous how it changes the mood. The papers are suddenly out in the lunchroom and whatever, and people are talking about it. And people are clamoring to, hey, when they're here, can I be interviewed next time? Which, obviously we need to manage that too. But the fact is, you can use that as a leader, use that dissemination of information to help improve overall, sort of morale and impact and everything of everybody else. Because a lot of times, if you're on a large fire right outside a large community, the impact isn't the same. But when you're impacting small communities where there's 3,000 people, like the tone will be very, very different in those small communities for the most part, right? Because the impacts are more significant on a per capita basis.
And I know in Alberta, for example, where I live, unfortunately, the fires are getting bigger, more catastrophic, more quick. And as much as I hate to say it, but we are not that far from having an entire community wiped out before any responders even get there. And so I think that speaks to just the urgency with regard to, having our ducks in a row and planning and all of those other things. But I wanted to loop back a bit, and you've talked a lot about making decisions. And one of the challenges I think that leaders have is balancing the short-term needs with that longer-term plan. So an example would be in a community perspective, or I'll use a business, for example, where you have to really stop the hemorrhaging. You have to stop the financial impacts, deal with the people impacts, but as quickly as possible, start thinking about what does it look like to get back to work. So what guidance would you give? Because that's something that you've had to deal with for 35 years, short term, and what is the long-term game? So how do you balance that?
Yeah, and I think those are always tough because, a lot of us who are leading in crisis management or incident management, we're not experts in all those other pieces. And I think about impacting a small community, for example. So you go in and you recommend an evacuation and the local government evacuates a small community and you've just now impacted all those businesses. And it's tourist season and there's an active wildfire. And so now people can't renew their house insurance. And so there's all these other impacts. But if you don't ask those questions to understand that, and so we always get the thing, when are you going to call this fire under control or out so that we can get back to doing our day-to-day business? And boy, those are hard, right? And I got caught by that one year on an incident where we rescinded our recommendation for an evacuation order to allow some local businesses who were being severely impacted to get back up and running. And 2 days later, we had to recommend it go back on. And so you got to balance that economic pressure, which quite frankly is political pressure from different levels of government, because our own government very rarely will put that kind of pressure on us. But sometimes you don't have all the facts and you got to still make a decision. But the bigger one is, and this goes back to this collaborative conversation up front, as the decision maker, the more you're fundamentally aware of the impacts of your decision, the more reactive you can be to move forward or backwards on those, depending on what it is. And simple things like fire impacts the power line, knocks power up to a small community. You're like, oh, what's the big deal? Power comes back on in 3 days. Well, except if you're the local butcher whose entire stock of meat now has spoiled, but those aren't the pieces that you think about if someone isn't telling you about these impacts. And you're like, whoa, maybe we need to let the power authority back in as soon as humanly possible. So maybe they can get the power back on day 1 or day 2 instead of day 8.
And the other thing too is recognizing the cascading events too. So if power is shut off for this community, maybe it's a hub for telecommunications, which services 911 or northern BC or whatever that looks like, right? So that's really, really important in terms of engaging the right people.
Yeah, and I think that's where this sort of more upfront, bringing all the stakeholders, bringing everybody in who may or may not be impacted of where the likelihood of this event going is, because then you can be upfront about what decision making looks like, and they can tell you what the decision will impact them, and then what that, for lack of a better term, what re-entry looks like and what the timing, because you make a recommendation to evacuate a small community, and then 3 days later you're like, yeah, you can go back, and you recommend. It's not that simple. They can't just go back because they don't have sewer or water or power or, so I think understanding the impacts and consequence of those decisions. And again, I think particularly in our agency where we tend to make recommendation, but where we get to do more is allowing those other parts of it back in to get the infrastructure back up and running ahead of time, and what criteria. And we get a lot of pressure, obviously, when the, power lines, phone lines, internet, high-speed telecommunication, when that stuff's all been impacted, there's a lot of pressure to get that stuff going back. And so I think working on your decision-making on how to let that happen, but you need to be thinking about that before you make the initial decision, because you have to think about consequence and impact.
And I think because of the private sector and the corporate sector going through this exact thing, where maybe it's not even looking externally from your agency or your company, but you could have all of those people from within your organization and at least at the table, like you said, and you may not make the right decision, but at least you're making an informed decision or an educated guess with regard to, moving forward. So I want to wrap it up here, Glen. And so let's say that with all of your years of experience, you now have the opportunity to have a coffee with, let's say it's a corporate manager. They are facing, in this case, COVID, but it could be any kind of crisis for their company or their team. You've got a couple of minutes. You're going to, we'll take you out of the mess tent and we'll put you into a nice restaurant. Okay, so put yourself there. And you're going to sit down and have a coffee with them. What are 1 or 2 things that you would tell that leader, that corporate leader, based on all the years of experience that you have, that they're facing a crisis and you want to sit down and you want to help them? What would you tell them?
I think, the big thing they need to understand is that the worst thing they can do is nothing. Lack of action will derail any organization faster than even making a wrong decision, quite frankly. Now, no decisions are ever wrong, but the other thing is, and I use this term, paralysis by analysis, right? Like, at what point do you just got to make the decision? And so what I talk about with my folks sometimes, and I would suggest to this person, do you have 80% of the information you need to make a good decision? Yeah. Okay. So you could make a decision today. Yes. How long is it going to take to get the other 20% of the information that you need to be 100% certain? 3 weeks. Okay, do the cost benefit analysis. So you're not going to make a decision for an additional 3 weeks to gain another 20% certainty. Like, you need to think about those variables, right? And I think one of the failings I see in leadership, particularly in in leaders who struggle is that fact that they don't like to make decisions without having 100% of what they think is all of the information. And frankly, you never have it anyway. It's a perception based on your own reality. Because the minute you make it, someone will bring up something else you hadn't considered anyway. So sometimes, and I don't want to use a certain term, you got to go with your gut, but sometimes you kind of do. You got to say, I have enough information to make a well-informed decision right now. The other one I would suggest to people is, because you will end up being challenged on your decisions at some point, and is to, and I'm not saying that you document everything you think and say through an entire day, but there's key bullets you need to always want to make sure you have as backup, because inevitably someone will come to you and say, what were you thinking when you made this decision? And I think back to court actions, for example, which takes years to get through the system. And, I've been asked about decision making on an incident I was on in 2017, and I literally cannot recall what my thought process was to make that decision at all. Now, I know I made some notes, and I probably could read that book again and go, oh, that's what I was thinking. But it's a real interesting concept, and I see people do that. They just lock up. They don't have all the facts, and so they don't make a decision. And inaction in a crisis is worse than taking some action.
I really, really like that. And I think we see that a lot of times in corporate world, where now I've always thought, if I have 100% of the info, then I'm incorrect, because I'm missing an entirely, like a huge glaring gap in my knowledge somewhere.
You got a blind spot if you think you got it all.
Huge. Oh, Glen, we could talk for hours, my friend. So I will wrap it up here, and I will, with the caveat that heck, we may end up doing this again in the near future. In fact, I would love to do that, because the breadth of knowledge that you have, the years of experience, and having to make the tough decisions, I think really lends itself well to what a lot of people in the private sector are going through right now. And COVID-19 is the context now, but next year it could be something completely different. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for your service as well to, the citizens of your province, and the contributions you've given to people through your training and coaching and all of those other things. So thank you very, very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to us.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.